you so much for coming along to this special Earth Science Week event. So happy National Earth Science Week. The theme is Earth Science Everywhere. So the terrible joke I made last night, we're safe in the School of Geosciences. There's a lot of Earth science here. Anyway, right. So tonight is a special coordinated event between GeoSoc here at Sydney Uni and the Geological Society of Australia. First, I'd like to acknowledge that we are in Gadigal land, and I would like to pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And tonight we have two kind of talks, right? So first we'll have the Sydney Interplanetary Rover Initiative student team presenting. Then we'll have some recharge more of the pizzas, and then we'll have Bonnie at 6, and I'll introduce Bonnie at that stage. So hopefully folks online can hear okay, and we might not be able to hear you, so put comments and questions in the chat. But I'll hand over to James and team, and great to have you here. Welcome. Thanks for sharing this with us.
Hello, welcome. Happy Earth Science Week. And today we're going to be telling you a bit about the Sydney Interplanetary Rover Initiative, or SIRI as we like to call it. So this is essentially the structure of our presentation today. And yeah, so first of all, who are we? Well, I'm James. I'm a student here at USyd. I'm studying aerospace engineering and geology. I'm in first year right now. But I've been enjoying earth sciences for a while now. I did the Earth Science Olympiad in high school, where I gained some experience there. That was a lot of fun. And now I'm doing research, which is also a lot of fun. And yeah, here's the rest of my team.
Hi everyone, I'm Sapir. I'm currently studying my master's in mathematics. I did my undergrad in physics, so somewhat in the area of geoscience, kind of. But I've been working with the science subsystem as one of the co-leads with James for the last few months to try and actually get some payload out that could do some geosciences. And I'll now let Eugene introduce himself.
Hello, my name is Eugene. I'm studying physics and maths. I'm a relatively new member. I've joined SIRI this semester. I'm studying physics and maths, and I kind of wanted to apply that more towards real life applications. So that's why I decided to join this team, where I could take my expertise and skills into real life projects.
Hi everyone, my name is Amaya. I'm a second year student who's studying physics and computer science. I also am a relatively new member to SIRI, but like Eugene, I just wanted to apply my physics and computer science skills to something in a more practical manner.
All right, so that's who we are. But SIRI as a whole is the latest student team at the University of Sydney. There are, I think, 3 other student teams here, including the rocketry team, motorsports team, and Design Build Fly, which builds airplanes. And yeah, we are essentially an engineering and science team that's dedicated to designing rovers to explore the universe, which is a very lofty goal. But yeah, we were only founded in March this year, so we're still quite new as an organization. But we're growing quite fast, and we're making I think some fairly good progress. So yeah, watch this space. Our current goal is to work towards an entry into the Australian Rover Challenge and University Rover Challenge in 2026. These are like the biggest kind of engineering rover competitions in the world. And we'll tell you a bit more about them a little bit later in the talk. But yeah, essentially the idea is that the Australian Rover Challenge is based around a lunar environment, like a simulated lunar environment, as you can see here. And the idea is that you got to complete tasks as you would if you were driving a rover on the moon. Whereas the University Rover Challenge is based in it's set in Utah, in the desert. And it's all about a Mars environment and trying to do Mars-like science. All right. To start off, I'm going to give a kind of a hopefully brief overview of the relevant geology. And then I'll get my teammates here to go a bit into what we've been working on as a team. So why do we study planetary geology at all? The main thing is that there are, of course, lots of things that we can do on Earth to study geology, but really the processes that act on the surface of the Earth over time hide lots of evidence. And there are conditions here that are much different to what we see elsewhere. So it's quite interesting to go and look at other planets and moons and see what they have to offer, and how that differs from us. So as an example, I've got an image here of, this is from EarthBite, one of the research groups here at the university. This is a map of the Earth's oceans. And it might be a bit hard to see the time scale here, but essentially this shows that the age of the ocean floor only goes back to about 300 million years, which is quite young on geological timescales, considering like the 4 billion year age of the Earth. So there are a lot of dynamic processes that kind of erase the history of the Earth. Whereas if you look at somewhere like the moon, it takes a very, very long time for the surface of the moon to change. And there are parts that have been practically untouched since formation. I mean, apart from asteroid impacts and things like that. So if we go to the moon, we can kind of figure out more that we couldn't see on the Earth. So the moon, this is essentially what is considered the formation process of the moon as agreed by scientists. This is important because the idea is that the early Earth was hit by a large Mars-sized planet, and then that created a debris disk, which then eventually formed into the moon. And this means that the composition of rocks that we find on the moon are often similar to what we see here on Earth. And it means that we can use the moon as an analog for kind of the early conditions on the Earth. So overall, the kind of main features that are of interest on the moon are the lunar maria, which the singular form is mare, which are these large dark patches on the surface of the moon. There's no atmosphere on the moon, at least no detectable or significant atmosphere. There's also lunar highlands, which are these lighter regions, and there's also impact craters from the kind of bombardment of the moon by asteroids and meteors that we don't see on Earth because of the atmosphere. And then one of the most important things for scientific kind of exploration of the moon is these permanently shadowed regions, which are areas of the moon that never see any sunlight because as the moon rotates, it always keeps them in shadow. So those are some of the best candidates that we currently have for locations where there might be water ice. Yeah. So for the purposes of our competition, we're mainly looking for two minerals, which are ilmenite, which is an iron titanium oxide mineral, and water. And in the lunar maria, that's where we find a lot of basalt rocks, which are igneous rocks, and they contain, some of them contain quite high concentrations of ilmenite. As you can see here, there's an image of the Apollo 11 ascent stage, so coming back up from the moon, flying over some of that dark basalt rock. And we're also looking for ice, as I said before. So I've got an animated image here of, you can see the moon. As it goes through its phases, the direction of light changes. And at the poles, there are these craters, as you can see here, which, as the direction of the light changes, they never get any sunlight going down all the way to the bottom of them, which means there are regions that are constantly in shadow. So never see light. And that's important because there's no atmosphere on the moon. If sunlight hits any sort of volatile substance like water ice, it's just going to essentially evaporate and fly away. You're never going to see it again. And here are some of the possible ways that ice could exist in those craters. The one that we're looking most into as it's part of the competition is ice cemented regolith, where you've got grains of rock essentially stuck together by bits of ice. But these are all possible textures of ice that we may see once we do go and explore the lunar poles. Now, Mars. Mars, a long time ago, used to be an ocean planet similar to Earth. There is pretty strong evidence that there was a kind of global scale ocean on Mars. But after about 3.8 billion years ago, Mars lost its magnetosphere, which is the thing that kind of protects the atmosphere from just being blown away by the sun. And that kind of stripped the atmosphere off, and then all of the water was lost because of that. So now this is what Mars looks like in the modern day. And there's a reason that we call it the red planet, because it's overwhelmingly pretty red. It does have ice on it that's not in permanently shadowed regions, because there is a very thin atmosphere on Mars. The pressure of the atmosphere is only 0.6% of the pressure on Earth at sea level. So it's very, very thin atmosphere. But you do get these polar ice caps, which are predominantly about a kilometer thick of water ice permafrost. And then you've got seasonal ice caps of frozen carbon dioxide, which is quite interesting that 12 to 16% of the entire Martian atmosphere will freeze at either pole throughout the year. So as one side becomes winter, yeah, 12 to 16% of the atmosphere will freeze onto that pole, and then during summer it'll all evaporate and go to the other pole. There are also features such as caves, holes, and lava tubes, as well as volcanoes, which we see on Earth, but it's in a way not quite the same, because on Earth we have plate tectonics, which creates a lot of these features. But there's no real plate tectonics as we know it on Earth. On Mars, but that's a whole another talk to have. But yeah, one of the big things, especially for us, is that there are ancient rivers, lakes, and oceans that now no longer have any water in them, but there's still evidence of them being there. And a lot of them are located in impact craters because of the thin atmosphere on Mars. So, as I said before, there is ice water on Mars. However, some of the best indicators that we have for there being liquid water on the Martian surface in the past is that we have certain features in the landscape that on Earth we see only really formed by water. So therefore, we use this principle called uniformitarianism, which is the idea that processes that act today on Earth, we should expect to see them regardless of where we are or when we are in the universe. So as you can see here, we've got a river on Earth and a feature on Mars that exhibits a lot of the same kind of form. And there's a couple examples of this. This is a river delta. So as you can see on Earth, you've got this large river delta being exhibited. And then this is in Jezero crater, which one of the recent Mars rovers explored. As you can see, it's a very similar shape. And when we go and explore it, we find a lot of the same kind of structural features and things and minerals in the rocks that we would find on Earth. And there's also mud cracks, which is another indicator of water, where you've got clay minerals that basically soak up water, and then as it becomes summer or gets warmer, all of the water evaporates out, and the clay dries up, and as it dries, it shrinks, and it forms these cracks. So these are all indicators of there being water on Mars, and that's one of the things we have to search for in our mission is indicators of there being water in the past. However, one thing that we don't have yet on Mars, as far as we know, is fossils. As you can see here, we've got fossils on Earth. We've got plenty of them because things have been dying for as long as they've been alive. But on Mars, we haven't found anything yet. However, the thing to note is that while this is kind of the standard representation of fossils that you'll see a lot around, I assume a lot of you here are geoscientists, and you'll know that fossils like this aren't the only types of evidence of past life that we see. And there are things like certain minerals, isotopes, and chemicals that we can use as indicators of there being life. That, like, for example, some of the earliest evidence that we have on life is just certain isotope ratios and chemicals on Earth. So a lot of the research into kind of exobiology is going into that, as opposed to looking for big fossils like this. All right.
All right, thank you, James, for that wonderful introduction to geology. So now let's dive into how we're going to try and actually do something in the project that we're going to put together for these different competitions. So we're going to have these two competitions, and the idea is that each year they're different competitions, but the rules are roughly the same. So we've been planning ahead for it, and one way we've been looking at that is we're trying to make our rover essentially to kill two birds with one stone. The idea is that we're going to make one rover that can go both in the ARC, so this is the Australian Rover Challenge, this is a moon mission, and then we're going to also be able to have the same rover go into the University Rover Challenge, which is now a Mars mission. So there's slight differences in the goals of them, but let's go into the actual one. So these are the goals that we're going to be looking in the Australian Rover Challenge. So the first activity that we're going to be trying to do with our rover is to go and find these different sites that either have ice in them, ice cemented regolith, just like what we were discussing earlier, or there could be a site that has a lot of ilmenite inside it. So one of the things that we don't know in advance is which sites have the ilmenite in the actual percentages. So we don't know what concentration of the ilmenite there is in the actual soil. So in this case, the regolith. Now, we also don't know how much ice is in these either. So we need to figure out these concentrations with our instruments. And the idea is that our rover would go there and find the concentrations, and in the meantime, if it finds itself in a water area, so an area with ice cemented regolith, the idea is that it's supposed to extract as much as it can in the short time that we have. So in the competition, we're only going to really have around 40 minutes to do this. So we have to be very efficient in our task. So why would someone want to do this? Well, the idea is that eventually one day, if these ideas could actually, start something real, the idea is that you could go into space yourself, and on the moon, for example, you can start extracting water as most efficiently as possible and potentially lead to the future of a way of actually extracting water out for human civilization to potentially live in and around the South Pole. So this is the main idea behind this. And the other challenge that we're going to go into is the University Rover Challenge. So the idea is that now this is more based on looking at life and biology that could have formed on Mars itself. So the idea in the competition is that we need to go around and be able to actually take pictures and also be able to determine the location that we're at, and also do some analysis of what potential life there might be in the area. So what this might look like is we may have some sort of samples that we take, and then we may be able to try and determine what potential biological pieces maybe are left in the sample. But this area we haven't entirely focused our research into yet. We've been trying to make sure we perfect the Australian Rover Challenge first, and the idea is that we would then get the University Rover Challenge components put together and put it into our rover with the payload. So now the big question we're going to ask while we're doing this mission right now is, which type of method should we use? So we have been looking into spectroscopy as a method of actually trying to determine what the concentrations inside the regolith is. So how this might look like is part of the design that we're going to be doing at the Siri team. And what other questions we have is what sensors we may use. So we've come up with a few of them. And we're also going to be looking at what some design processes that we're going to have to put together to actually have a realistic payload, because we're all students, so we need to make this thing actually happen. So of course we have to think about that. And the final thing is, how do we actually then process this data? So once we've got the measurements, are we going to be confident that the measurements we took are actually going to be any use to us? So that's something we're going to have to think about. And that's the questions that we have been trying to answer for the last few months. So one of the ideas that we've had for our ARC challenge is to have this rover with this decoupled payload, essentially. So it's a separate module. And the idea is that it's going to lower itself and then drill into the actual regolith on the ground and take that up inside its tube. And then we're going to put it into a specific chamber based on what we would like to do with it. So if we want to actually extract out the water, we would take it to this side. And the idea is that it's going to get sucked into this filter, and hopefully, if we make it heated and do some fine enough engineering, the idea is that the water will come out of it and then extract out as much as possible. And then all the leftover regolith will come out of the rover, and we would not have excess mass on our rover. Now, if we wanted to measure things, which is really what we would like to mostly do here, is take it inside this other chamber, which will actually take that regolith. And then we're going to have some instruments in there. For example, we've got an electrical conductivity meter. So we'll talk about that in a second. And then we've also got a load cell. So they're going to be some of our measurement instruments. But we've also got our nice spectrophotometer on the outside. So some of you probably will know what this is. The idea is that it's going to send out little electromagnetic waves, and then they're going to reflect back off the actual ground. And we're going to pick up the differences and be able to use that to detect if there was changes and calibrate that based on regolith that we're going to make in a lab. So we actually have instructions from the competitions of how to create this regolith. So we know how to create the ice cemented regolith and also how to create the ilmenite rich regolith. So we've ordered some of them and they're going to be on their way. We're going to be putting hubs together, and then this is what we're going to be doing with that to actually test it. So this is the big overview. So how we're going to do the actual spectroscopy. So the idea is that if you don't know what this is, the idea is that you essentially send out electromagnetic waves, and you know that when you have a molecule, it's going to vibrate, essentially speaking, with the electromagnetic waves. And the idea is that the response that they are going to emit is going to reflect back, and that reflection may change its particular intensity. So the idea is that we would pick up a different intensity when we actually do it. And this turns out to be characteristic of the actual material. So it's going to change based on the concentration percentage, and it will change based on what the actual substance is that it's made out of. And then we're going to calibrate our curves inside our lab while we're actually doing our own calibration with the regolith. And then the idea is that once we go out in the field, we're going to hopefully be able to pick back out those curves and see the actual what type of concentration we have and what type of regolith it is. So the actual inside of this instrument is going to look like a few things. So there's going to be this is going to be a laser that essentially sends out a laser beam. It's going to hit the sample on the ground. So if you think of the ground as here, this laser will come in, and then it's going to reflect back out the light. Now, we've got this beam splitter here, so I don't know how much physics technicality you know, but the idea is that this is going to split the light into two, and one of them is going to be the light that we're going to actually want to see reflected back, and that light is what we want to make go through into our detector, and then we're going to do essentially spectroscopy. So all this is looking at the individual wavelengths of the light that we get back out, and then we can then determine what the percentage of the actual changes in the intensities are. So that's the more complex instrument we've got. We're hoping that gives us, a quite high accuracy, because the competition actually requires us to be within plus minus 0.5% of the actual true weight in the competition. So that's why we've decided with that instrument. And now we're going to look into some other instruments we've got. So I'll pass on to Amaya and Eugene.
Yep. So this is the EC meter. Like it says, it measures electrical conductivity. That's why it's EC meter. And where it would be is essentially the diagram that was earlier. Yep. So this is where it would be. So once the drill extracts the sample, goes over here. And if you want to analyze it, it'll go over here. And then you put the regolith over here. And that's where the EC meter would be already placed. So that is how we directly measure it. And essentially, basically, each material has its own conductivity, which means how well electricity can pass through with it. Now, sand has a certain amount of conductivity, not very high. Ilmenite doesn't have high conductivity either, but it's relatively higher compared to sand. So depending on how much ilmenite there is, the conductivity of this regolith sample is going to change. So by using the EC meter, you can identify essentially how much ilmenite there will be.
And like Safir said before, one good thing about using the EC meter is that it's essentially another form of measurement. So we can compare the measurements that we get of the EC meter to that of the Raman spectroscopy in case anything occurs. In case anything occurs, we have a backup. But even so, we can also just compare the ranges of which we take the measurements and perhaps get a more accurate measurement, because we're hoping to be within 0.5% of the true value.
And then the second component is the load cell. This is essentially going to be used to measure the weight percentage of the water. Essentially, we know what they call the density of the water and the density of the remainder of the regolith, which would be whitewash sand. And because we know those two densities, we know that that density multiplied the volume of the water plus that density of the regolith multiplied by the volume of the regolith should be the total mass. And we also know the total volume because of the fact that the sand is going to fill a certain amount of volume of our compartment. So this means that once we weigh it, we have these two equations with two unknowns, which means we can solve it. And basically this gives us the weight percentage of the water within the ice cemented regolith.
So I'll just explain how we're going to exactly use the load cell. So if we go back a bit, Yes. So the regolith will enter and it'll be in this compartment on the left. And this is like a preliminary design, but essentially we will have some mechanism to put the regolith in here, and this whole thing will be suspended. When the regolith is placed in this chamber over there with the cross, it's gonna push down onto the load cell, and in turn that's going to kind of deform the load cell in a way. And what the load cell does is it converts that mechanical stress into a change in voltage, and using that we can determine the weight of the regolith that's being measured. And from there, since we don't need the regolith anymore, we just release it back into the environment.
Yep, so that's the instruments, and hopefully that's some interesting applications of what you could do to try and do geoscience, but really in space now. So what are the impacts of this you might ask? Well, of course, the immediate answer is we're going to have a way of measuring how much concentration there is. But if you think bigger than that, and of course that's what people really want to do, is one day the hope is that we can really accurately measure exactly what's going on in the regolith on the moon, and hopefully maybe you could send out your own rover, your own payload there, and figure out locations where potentially there's a high concentration of water available, or these ilmenite materials that you could use together to actually build something. So the idea one day is we could maybe even build a Mars or a moon base, and that's the big picture of what we could do with this. So why is our project going to be of importance? Well, it's because we're providing something that is really done with a student team, which means it's going to be cheap. So really, if this works, then anything can happen. So thank you for everyone joining. That's everything.
Are there any questions?
So how long is this going to take you, do you think?
Yeah, so there were two questions. One of them was how do you fuel the rover? How do you power it? And then the second one was NASA's been doing this for a while, so why is this different to what they do? To answer the first question, in brief, essentially, this is a rover designed for a competition. So we do have access to it before and after the competition. So we're using electrical batteries to power it, and we can just replace those as needed. But if you were to actually launch one of these rovers to the moon or to Mars, there are kind of two main ways of doing it right now, which are either to use solar panels to generate electricity using the sun, or to use nuclear power, which can be pretty compact. But yeah, because we're just a competition team right now, that's not really something that we're looking too far into. And then to answer your other question, yes, NASA has been doing this for a while. And in fact, when they did the Apollo missions, as I showed before in this slide, you can see this rock here. The reason I showed it is because that is one of the rocks that they brought back from the moon. So the purpose of a mission like this is not to understand what's going on in the lunar rocks necessarily, because we know that there's ilmenite there already, and we know generally where it is and where it exists. But the purpose of a mission like this is that this is an exploration mission. So we're going to an environment like this, and we're going around and looking for the distribution of ice and ilmenite in a specific area, with the intention of building like a human habitation there. So the idea is that you could land this rover before you land people there. You could go around, figure out where the best deposits of water and ilmenite are, and then you could use that to inform where you would land your humans. Just makes the process much easier.
So also one thing I'll add is NASA is actually trying to do this too recently with the Viper project, but that didn't actually go into space, unfortunately, because of funding reasons. So this is actually something that NASA is still wanting to do, in fact. So it's not something that is not of urgence.
We have a special guest at the Dr. Bonnie is from APL NASA, trying to do something along the lines of biosignatures. So
Yes.
you should talk.
Right.
Get
Good.
some ideas.
I guess like another way you could look at it is the fact that, like Sapir mentioned, we have limited resources and a very limited time period to essentially achieve this. So while NASA has much more resources, a greater timeline, much more essentially manpower to work with, because of the fact that this is limited, in a sense, the outcomes of the competition or the outcomes of the rover at the end could kind of show, well, how can we make this even more scalable, or how can we make many rovers at like a very shorter amount of time? So the limitations that are put on us, in a sense, is sort of making us think, how can we like optimize it even further with limited resources, with like a shorter budget, so that more people can do this as well, to make it like more recreatable to everyone else, in a sense.
The main reason to mine ilmenite is actually not necessarily the oxygen, but rather the iron in it. So obviously iron, and especially steel, is a very good building resource. And if you want to set up a permanent civilization on another planetary body, it's not really that economical to bring everything with you. So you can't just mine everything and then launch it and do it that way. The best thing to do is called in situ resource utilization, which is going to a planetary body, mining the resources there, and then manufacturing. Exactly. And water also contains hydrogen, which can be used as rocket fuel, which is fun. Yeah, it's a very good question. And the answer to that is that while the University River Challenge is set in the Utah desert and you're looking at actual rocks and outcrops and things like that, the Australian River Challenge, which deals with the lunar environment, that's set in Adelaide, at the University of Adelaide, and they basically build a lunar environment there. So the materials that they use to make the regolith are very controlled. So we have a very good idea of what the regolith is going to be made of. Of course, if we were building this for an actual lunar environment, we would have to deal with those types of issues. But because we know pretty well the composition of the regolith, we can kind of avoid that.
And I'll add, that's not an unrealistic thing either, because we can get samples from space and bring it back if we need, as a way of doing this for the real deal. So it's a normal thing for, I mean, NASA's been doing this already with different samples from the past, where they've been analyzing it and understanding what it may be containing, and therefore trying to design their missions around that. So yeah.
One of these companies is actually offering this one.
Yeah. So there's a
Question.
Yep. So Sabine was asking, is there not a company that's offering a spot on a rover or a lander? And yeah, so there's a Japanese company called iSpace that designs lunar rovers and lunar landers, and they've agreed that if we can get a payload done in time, they'll launch it on their next lunar rover, which is fun. Yeah.
So we actually went through a few ideas at the beginning. The main problem is that we could do much fancier instruments. So in fact, Nervous, this is one of the instruments that NASA has already built for exactly this purpose of doing spectroscopy to determine what is going to be the percentage, or not the percentage necessarily, but what's the actual chemical buildup in regolith. But because we are trying to focus our designs in a way that's achievable in the time we have, we found that out of the options we looked into, the Raman spectroscopy was something that we could actually build ourselves. So that's why we decided to go with that, even though there may be other methods that we could have gone into. Like, for example, the EC meter and the actual, what was it? The load cells. So these are methods that we know will give us at least first order results. So it's sort of a fail safe for us. In terms of other instruments, so we've been mainly wanting to try and get something that just works right now as well. So we definitely could have gone into a whole world of all possible instruments, but we decided this is what we're going to go forward with because this is what we can see happen here.
And like I would love to build like a laser-induced breakdown spectroscoper because they're pretty cool, or like a mini mass spectrometer or something. But the main issue that we're dealing with is pretty low power budget and pretty tight space and weight constraints. So this kind of looks like the best option. And these are things that have precedent in that other student teams have built these devices. So those are like we kind of focus on these fairly yeah, from the start.
So Richard Scott asks, how long will this take?
Well, yeah, so we, as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, our current plan is to enter the competition in 2026. So we've been around since March, and we have done our preliminary design review. So we've like all of the different subsystems within the team. So the team as a whole is split into our science subsystem, and then a series of engineering subsystems, and then a business team. And essentially all of these different subsystems did their preliminary designs, and then we got that reviewed by kind of a panel of engineering experts. And then I think next July we have planned our critical design review, which is kind of the next stage from that. And the idea is that we'll have much more advanced designs done by then, so we can start like manufacturing things and getting everything built. But yeah, currently the plan is 2026.
I was curious about the idea of using the same rover on the moon and Mars. What have you considered to convince you that the same design could work for both?
Yeah, so I think it's worth clarifying that when we say like the same rover on the moon and Mars, we don't mean like exactly the same instrumentation. The idea behind that concept is that we have sort of a pretty versatile structure of the rover, and this is mainly something that the other engineering subsystems are looking into. But the idea is that there are specific challenges that we have to achieve in these different competitions. So for our purposes, we would essentially build two different science payloads and then be able to swap them out between the competitions. So we wouldn't be using exactly the same science payload between them.
I have is like, what's the status in this community of open sourcing all of these technologies to try to democratize it and open it up to for development as well?
Yeah. Sabine has asked what's the current status in terms of making things open source and available. And within student teams specifically, they tend not to share what they've been working on. And that's just because like they want to win the competition. Yeah, so that like yeah. But there definitely are open source projects in this kind of direction. One that comes to mind is I think it's called the Open Microscopy Project, which there are projects like that that are essentially trying to design fairly accurate scientific instruments that can be constructed on a 3D printer and accessed by anyone, and especially devices that can be used for medical purposes. Are that there are definitely projects opening up right now for that, but yeah, that there's still in early days, I'd say. Yeah. Yeah. That definitely is an issue that should be considered if you're building kind of a rover that will be going to Mars. But within our scope, because as I said before, we're just competing in a competition. Um, so yeah, it's not so much a consideration that we have to have. But yeah, that's definitely a good point.
Because like the main two things we were trying to measure is the weight percentage of water, which is from the weight of the sample, and then the ilmenite percentage within it, and that's based off of the Raman spectroscopy and electrical conductivity. And none of those would be heavily affected if something were to like a little bit of dust were to get in. Of course, it'd be an issue if like somehow we picked up like the wrong rock or something like that. But obviously, we're not going to do that. So hopefully, yeah. So it doesn't have to be fully sterile, at least to achieve our goals of these competitions. Yeah.
So I just want to say, why do you want to have you sort of very practical to sort of know that even because molecular days at some point you might sort of get broken down or have a bit of error and like maybe protein and stuff. Have you in your same safe situation?
Sorry, just you're saying, have we considered how we're going to use it as a failsafe? Is that what the question is?
Yes.
So when I say failsafe, there's two ways we've tried to do that. So there's one way where one of the let me go to the picture of it. So the idea is that one of the instruments, so the spectrophotometer is on the outside, and so this will not actually need to interact with the regolith at all. The idea is that because we've brought in all the regolith into here, hopefully we can then actually get, our philosophically speaking or directly speaking, we're trying to literally measure it, whereas the spectrophotometer may have errors in some sense as well, because there could be, for example, a little bit of light that comes in from beneath and influences the measurements. And so the idea is that because we've got this actual chamber that has everything in there, we can then know that we at least got a number. In terms of the precision, we know that the load cell and EC meter, we can calibrate them, but the idea is that in science, we would like to at least get as much precision we can in the time we have. So the spectrophotometer will have more precision is what we're hoping, but these ones will have possibly less precision, but at least they are a backup in some sense. That's what the idea is right now. Does that answer your question? I don't know if there was more that I could have said.
So like when you do science, of course, you hypothesize and then you experiment. You can kind of think of this as the whole hypothesizing stage where based on the given information, we think, what can we do to actually address this competition? And now we're actually going to try and experiment with this. And once we get lab access and we order all of these materials, we're actually going to try setting this up and in the lab actually try to see if this works. And if something doesn't work, then we might have to change our plan, but the idea is that this is our plan for now. This is what we have designed, and we actually want to see if this works, and that will be through our experimentation stage.
Well, please join me in thanking the Siri team. Okay, great stuff, folks. For those people online, sorry, we're going to take a 5-minute break. People need a little bit more pizza, and then we'll set Bonnie up for the talk in about 7 minutes.